Admiral Jake Morrison gripped the metal railing of his command bridge as another wave of emergency signals flooded the holographic displays around him. The massive viewing screen showed incoming data streams from across the galaxy, each one painting a darker picture than the last. 3 hours had passed since the first transmission arrived, and Jake could still barely believe what he was reading. Lieutenant Beth Coleman looked up from her station, her face pale under the blue glow of her monitors. "Sir, we're getting another emergency broadcast from Council Space. This one's different though. It's not a warning or a status update." She paused, checking her readings twice before continuing. "It's a formal request for military assistance from Earth." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In over 200 years of human space exploration, the Galactic Council had never once asked for help from the people they called Deathworlders. Humans were tolerated, barely, and kept at the very edges of civilized space. The Council's member species looked down on humanity as violent barbarians who had somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel. Jake walked closer to the main display, studying the incoming data. The images were horrifying. Entire star systems had gone dark. Massive space stations that had stood for thousands of years were now nothing but twisted metal and debris. The enemy responsible for this destruction wasn't some rival alien empire or political uprising. It was something far worse. The Void Swarm had returned. Captain Roy Patterson stepped up beside his admiral, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Roy had served in the Outer Rim conflicts for 30 years, and Jake had never seen him look this serious. "Admiral, take a look at what they're offering us in exchange for help. Full membership in the Galactic Council, complete access to their technology databases, trading rights across all member worlds. Hell, they're even offering us 3 systems of our own choosing." Jake read through the offer again, his jaw tightening with each line. These were concessions that human diplomats had been trying to negotiate for decades. Things the Council had dismissed as impossible just months ago. The fact that they were putting everything on the table meant only one thing. They were terrified. The Zilani Federation, known throughout the galaxy for their peaceful nature and advanced defensive technologies, were facing complete extinction. Their beautiful crystal cities and floating gardens would be nothing but cosmic dust within hours. The Council's combined military forces, representing dozens of species and thousands of years of tactical evolution, had been swept aside like leaves in a hurricane. "Sir," Lieutenant Coleman called out again, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm reading the tactical reports from the front lines. The swarm broke through the defensive line Alpha 6 hours ago. Beta line fell 2 hours after that. The final defensive positions around the Zilani home worlds are reporting massive casualties." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the implications. The Void Swarm was something from the galaxy's nightmares. Ancient mechanical entities that consumed everything in their path, growing stronger with each world they devoured. They had appeared once before, thousands of years ago, and nearly wiped out all organic life before mysteriously vanishing into deep space. Now they were back, and apparently hungry. "Admiral," Captain Patterson said quietly, "you know what this means, don't you? For the first time in galactic history, they need us more than we need them." Jake nodded slowly. It was ironic, really. For centuries, the so-called civilized species had treated humans like dangerous animals, barely worthy of acknowledgement. They whispered about humanity's violent history, their tendency to solve problems with overwhelming force, their refusal to back down from any fight, no matter how hopeless. It seemed, the galaxy called them Deathworlders because humans came from a planet that tried to kill them every single day. Earth's weather could destroy cities. Its animals hunted in packs, and its people had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war. Other species found this terrifying and primitive, but now, faced with an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, negotiated with, or scared away, The galaxies suddenly wanted their Deathworlders after all. Jake turned to face his crew, seeing the mix of anticipation and worry in their eyes. Everyone on the bridge knew what came next. There were weapons in human space that even their own people feared to use. Ships and technologies developed during humanity's darkest periods, when survival meant being willing to destroy everything rather than accept defeat. "Open a channel to Fleet Command," Jake ordered, his voice carrying across the silent bridge. "Tell them to begin the awakening protocol. Tell them to wake the horsemen." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Officers turned to stare at their admiral with wide eyes. Even the veteran Captain Patterson took a step backward. The horsemen weren't just ships. They were humanity's answer to extinction itself. Director Kelly Park stood behind reinforced blast glass, watching as machinery that hadn't moved in half a century slowly came to life. The Titan shipyard stretched out before her like a metallic graveyard, filled with humanity's most carefully guarded secrets. These weren't ordinary military vessels or exploration ships. These were the weapons that humanity had built when they truly believed the universe wanted them dead. The facility orbited Pluto in complete secrecy, hidden behind layers of security clearances and classified protocols that most humans didn't even know existed. Only a handful of people in the entire solar system had the authorization to be here, and even fewer had the stomach for what they were about to witness. Chief Engineer Tom Bradley's hand shook slightly as he input the awakening codes into his console. He had been present for the last activation 50 years ago, and the memory still gave him nightmares. Beginning extraction sequence for the Death's Head, he announced over the facility's communication system. All non-essential personnel report to minimum safe distance immediately. The warning wasn't just protocol. It was a desperate attempt to protect people from seeing things that would haunt them forever. Massive blast doors that had been sealed. 4 decades began to split apart with a sound like thunder. The metal groaned and protested as hydraulic systems strained against mechanisms that had been deliberately designed to be nearly impossible to open. Beyond those doors lay something that existed in folded space-time, a ship that was technically present but also somehow not entirely there. The Death's Head emerged slowly, like a nightmare dragging itself into reality. The vessel was over 1 kilometer long, but its exact dimensions seemed to shift depending on how you looked at it. Light bent around its hull in impossible ways, creating shadows that fell upward and reflections that showed things that weren't actually there. The ship's black surface was covered in warning symbols carved deep into the metal, written in languages that belonged to dead civilizations. "Jesus Christ," whispered Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes, one of the newer staff members who had never seen the horseman before. "What the hell is that thing?" "That," Director Park replied grimly, "is what happens when humans get scared enough to break the laws of physics." Colonel Beth Watson monitored the awakening process from the main command center, her eyes fixed on screens showing readouts that most scientists would have declared impossible. "The Void Ripper is responding to startup protocols," she reported, trying to keep her voice steady. "Quantum destabilizers are coming online. Reality anchors are holding steady." The second ship began to manifest from its dimensional storage. And this one was even more disturbing than the first. The Void Ripper looked like someone had taken a normal battleship and then twisted it through dimensions that shouldn't exist. Parts of the vessel seemed to fade in and out of existence, while other sections appeared to be made of crystallized spacetime itself. Dr. Robert Chen, the facility's lead physicist, stood at his monitoring station with sweat beading on his forehead, despite the controlled temperature. He had been part of the original design team for these weapons 30 years ago, when humanity had faced a different extinction-level threat. "I helped create these abominations," he muttered to himself, watching as impossible energies coursed through the ship's hull, "and they still terrify me more than anything else in the universe." 3 more ships followed the first 2, each one more nightmarish than the last. The entropy storm looked like a normal vessel that was slowly dissolving into pure chaos. The reality bomb appeared to be a ship-sized hole in space that somehow contained devastating weapons systems. The final ship, called simply the End, was so disturbing to look at that most of the monitoring staff had to turn away from their screens. These weren't just weapons. They were humanity's answer to the fundamental question of what happens when survival requires you to become something monstrous. Tom Bradley ran diagnostics on each vessel as they fully materialized in normal space. All ships are responding to commands. Weapon systems are charging. God help us all, but they're ready for combat. The Horsemen had been built during humanity's darkest period, when Earth's best minds had been tasked with creating weapons that could fight enemies who played by different rules than conventional warfare. The designers had been given unlimited resources and only one instruction: build something that could win against impossible odds, no matter what the cost. They had succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares. Director Park activated the facility-wide communication system, her voice echoing through every corridor and chamber. All personnel, the awakening is complete. The Horsemen are ready for deployment. May God have mercy on whatever they're about to face, because these ships certainly won't. In the cold depths of space around Pluto, 5 impossible vessels waited for their orders, ready to remind the galaxy why humans were called Deathworlders. The human fleet materialized from hyperspace into what could only be described as the end of everything. Admiral Jake Morrison gripped his command chair as the main view screen filled with images that would have broken the minds of most civilized species. Burning Zolani vessels tumbled through space like dying fireflies, their elegant crystal hulls cracked and bleeding atmosphere into the void. Massive defense stations that had protected these worlds for thousands of years were being torn apart by creatures that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of reality. The void swarm was everywhere. The mechanical horrors moved through space like a living plague, each unit the size of a small moon but shaped like something from humanity's darkest nightmares. They flowed and shifted as they moved, their surfaces rippling with technologies that the galaxy's greatest scientists couldn't begin to understand. Where they passed, matter itself seemed to unravel, leaving behind twisted remnants that hurt to look at directly. "My God," breathed Captain Roy Patterson, staring at the tactical display. The reports didn't do this justice. There must be thousands of them. On the bridge of the Death's Head, Weapons Officer Kelly James worked frantically at her console, trying to lock onto targets that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Sir, I'm having trouble getting a clean lock. These things are shifting through space-time like they're swimming through it." "Then we adapt," replied Commander Beth Taylor, her voice cold as ice. "That's what we do. Target the largest concentration and prepare to fire reality disruptors." The crew exchanged glances. Reality disruptors weren't just weapons in the traditional sense. They were tools that fundamentally altered the basic structure of existence itself. Using them was like performing surgery with a nuclear bomb, and the consequences could ripple across dimensions in ways no one fully understood. "Target acquired," Kelly announced, her finger hovering over the firing control. "All stations report ready. Fire." What happened next would have been impossible to explain to any conventional physicist. The Death's Head's main weapon didn't shoot energy or projectiles. Instead, it reached out and simply declared that certain sections of space no longer existed. Reality twisted and folded in on itself, creating wounds in the fabric of the universe that bled impossible colors. Where the weapon struck, entire formations of void swarm units simply vanished. Not destroyed, not vaporized, but erased from existence, so completely that the space they had occupied forgot they had ever been there. The surviving swarm units reacted with something that might have been confusion. For millions of years, they had adapted to every weapon the galaxy could throw at them. Plasma cannons, quantum torpedoes, gravitational disruptors. Dimensional phase weapons. Nothing had ever been more than a temporary inconvenience. They had evolved to counter every known form of attack. But this was something entirely different. Commander Ryan Miller watched from the bridge of the Void Ripper as his ship's entropy cannons came online. These weapons didn't destroy targets in any conventional sense. Instead, they accelerated the aging process of whatever they hit, forcing enemy vessels to experience millions of years of decay in a matter of seconds. "Firing entropy cannons," announced his weapons officer. "Targets are aging rapidly. Enemy vessels are. They're crumbling to dust." The results were horrifying and beautiful at the same time. Massive swarm units that had seemed indestructible moments before began to corrode and collapse as their molecular structures broke down under the weight of accelerated time. Metal that had endured for eons turned to rust and scattered into space as cosmic dust. But the humans weren't finished. The reality bomb activated its quantum virus payload, sending streams of corrupted data directly into the swarm's collective consciousness. The mechanical plague had always adapted by learning from their enemies, incorporating new technologies and defenses into their collective knowledge. Now that variability became their weakness as human-designed viruses turned their own adaptation systems against them. Swarm units began attacking each other, their corrupted programming unable to distinguish between friend and foe. Others simply shut down completely, their ancient minds overwhelmed by paradoxes and logical impossibilities that the quantum viruses had planted in their systems. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Beth Coleman from the communication station, "I'm picking up something incredible. The swarm units are actually retreating. They're falling back toward the outer system." The bridge fell silent. In over 3 million years of recorded galactic history, the Void Swarm had never retreated from anything. They consumed, they adapted, they overwhelmed. Retreat wasn't part of their programming, but they were learning about fear. Admiral Morrison watched as his fleet continued their assault, each impossible weapon adding to the carnage. The end fired dimensional bombs that deleted entire sectors of enemy ships from reality, while the entropy storm unleashed cascading waves of chaos that unraveled the fundamental forces holding matter together. The surviving Zilani vessels hung in space like stunned observers, their crews barely able to process what they were witnessing. These Deathworlders weren't just fighting the Void Swarm, they were winning using weapons that seemed to violate every natural law the galaxy understood. "Admiral," Captain Patterson said quietly, "the enemy formation is breaking apart. They're running for the edge of the system." For the first time in recorded history, something had made the unstoppable Void Swarm afraid, and that something was humanity, wielding the power to fight extinction with extinction itself. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. Admiral Jake Morrison floated in his environmental suit outside the command ship, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Where the Korath system's third planet had once orbited, there was now a jagged tear in space itself. The wound pulsed with colors that had no names, bleeding energy that made his instruments scream warnings about dangerous radiation levels. But this wasn't radiation in any sense that science understood. This was reality itself trying to heal, from damage that went deeper than atoms or molecules. The planet hadn't been destroyed, it had been edited out of existence, and the universe was still trying to figure out what to do with the empty space it left behind. "Sir, you need to see the latest readings," came Dr. Jennifer Lopez's voice through his helmet. "Come." Her usually steady tone carried an edge of barely controlled panic. "The damage assessment is worse than we initially thought." Jake activated his suit's thrusters and returned to the ship, dreading what he was about to hear. The victory against the Void Swarm had come at a price that no one had fully calculated during the heat of battle. Now, as the smoke cleared and the enemy fled toward the galactic rim, humanity was facing the consequences of unleashing weapons that were never meant to be used. In the ship's main briefing room, Dr. Lopez had spread holographic displays across every available surface. Each one showed a different type of cosmic damage, and all of it traced back to human weapon systems. Her hands shook slightly as she pointed to the first display. The reality disruptors have fundamentally altered the fabric of space-time across 3 entire sectors, she explained, her voice hollow. We're not talking about temporary damage here. These are permanent changes to the basic structure of the universe. Stars in the affected regions are aging at different rates. Some are burning faster, others slower. The gravitational constants have shifted. Jake studied the readings, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. What does that mean for the people living in those systems? The inhabited worlds are experiencing time dilation effects. On some planets, a day now lasts 36 hours. On others, it's only 18. The biological and ecological impacts will be catastrophic. Entire civilizations will have to relearn how to live in a universe that no longer follows the rules they've known for millions of years. Captain Roy Patterson entered the briefing room carrying another set of reports, his face grim. The casualty assessments are coming in from the Zolani Federation. We saved them from extinction, but their own scientists are requesting immediate evacuation from 12 star systems. They're calling our weapons reality cancer, damage that spreads and grows worse over time. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Humanity had been called saviors and heroes by the very species that had spent centuries treating them like dangerous barbarians. But now, those same grateful survivors were discovering that their rescuers possessed weapons that could unmake creation. Itself, sir, interrupted Lieutenant Beth Coleman from the communications station. I'm receiving requests from 17 different species asking for detailed specifications on our weapon systems. They want to know exactly what we used and how it works. Jake shook his head. Denied. All requests for weapons data are denied indefinitely. The truth was that even humanity's top scientists weren't entirely sure how their most dangerous weapons functioned. The Horsemen had been built during desperate times by teams of researchers who had been willing to experiment with forces that responsible physicists would never touch. The weapons worked, but the full extent of their capabilities remained a mystery even to their creators. On the bridge of the Death's Head, Colonel Beth Watson watched through the viewports as the last Void Swarm units disappeared beyond the galactic rim. The mechanical plague was retreating for the first time in recorded history, carrying with it a new understanding of what it meant to face an enemy that refused to accept defeat. We won, she said to her bridge crew, but the words tasted like ashes. We actually won against something that has been consuming galaxies for millions of years. Her weapons officer looked up from his console. Colonel, the quantum virus we deployed is still active in some of the fleeing swarm units. Our weapons are essentially rewriting their basic programming as they retreat. Beth nodded grimly. Even in victory, humanity's weapons continued to spread chaos and change throughout the galaxy. The Void Swarm wasn't just retreating, it was being fundamentally altered by contact with human technology, transformed into something that might be even more unpredictable than before. The communication system crackled to life with a message from Admiral Morrison. All ships, begin withdrawal to safe distance. We need to establish a quarantine zone around the affected systems, until we can better understand the long-term effects of our weapons. As the human fleet pulled back from the battlefield, the surviving alien species began to truly comprehend what they had witnessed. Humans weren't just tough survivors from a harsh world who had learned to fight dirty. They were beings who had stared into the abyss of total annihilation and responded by creating tools that could rewrite the fundamental laws of existence. The galaxy had been saved, but it would never be the same again. And somewhere in the depths of space, fleeing toward unknown regions, the Void Swarm carried with it humanity's greatest gift, the knowledge that some fights are worth any price, even if that price is the universe itself. Victory had never felt so much like defeat. The Galactic Council chambers buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from dozens of species filled the massive amphitheater. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting or trade negotiation. This was history in the making. For the first time since the Council's formation over 10,000 years ago, they were formally welcoming humanity as equal members rather than barely tolerated outcasts. Ambassador Robert Taylor walked through the ornate halls, leading to the main chamber, flanked by his small human delegation. The alien architecture around him was beautiful, but cold, all flowing curves and crystalline surfaces that reflected light in impossible ways. It was the kind of place designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant, a reminder of just how ancient and advanced the Council's member species considered themselves to be. But today, the roles were reversed. Today, the galaxy's oldest civilizations were the ones feeling small. The massive doors to the chamber opened with a sound like singing crystal, and Robert stepped onto the speaking platform at the center of the room. Thousands of alien eyes focused on him, representing species that had mastered space travel when humanity was still discovering fire. The Zalani delegation sat in places of honor, their crystal-like skin still bearing the marks of recent trauma. The Korthan Empire's representatives maintained their usual stoic expressions, but Robert could see the fear lurking behind their compound eyes. Honored members of the Galactic Council, Robert began, his voice carried by translation systems to every corner of the chamber. We stand here today, not as conquerors or saviors, but as neighbors who answered a call for help. The formal ceremony began with speeches from council leaders, each one offering humanity rewards that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. Full council membership with voting rights, access to the combined technological databases of 47 different civilizations, territorial grants that would triple humanity's current space holdings, trading agreements that could make Earth one of the wealthiest worlds in the galaxy. But as each offer was presented, Robert politely declined most of them. "We appreciate the recognition," he said to the increasingly confused assembly, "but we didn't fight the Void Swarm for glory or profit. We did it because extinction is everyone's enemy, and some fights are bigger than politics or territorial disputes." Admiral Jake Morrison stepped forward to address the more practical concerns. The military leaders in the audience leaned forward, hungry for details about the weapons that had accomplished the impossible. Their own fleets had been swept aside like toys, but humanity had not only stopped the Void Swarm, but actually made them retreat. "I know many of you want to understand how our weapons work," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "I know you want to study them, copy them, maybe even improve on them. But I'm here to tell you something important. Those ships are going back into storage. We hope never to use them again." The chamber erupted in whispered conversations as the implications sank in. The weapons that had saved the galaxy were being locked away, treated like dangerous artifacts rather than tools of liberation. A Korthan general stood up, his insectoid form clicking with agitation. "But surely, Admiral, such weapons could be used to maintain peace throughout the galaxy. With that kind of power, we could prevent any future threats from emerging." Jake's expression hardened. "General, those weapons don't maintain peace. They rewrite reality itself. We used them because the alternative was the extinction of all organic life in the galaxy. But using them changes you, changes everything around you in ways that can never be undone." The price of victory was higher than any of us realized. The unspoken message hung in the air like a storm cloud. Humanity would use those weapons again, if necessary. But they understood the true cost in ways that other species couldn't begin to comprehend. As the ceremony concluded and the human delegation prepared to leave, the galaxy found itself grappling with a new reality. The species they had dismissed as violent primitives possessed weapons that could fight gods and win. More importantly, they had the wisdom to fear those weapons and the discipline to put them away when the crisis passed. Robert Taylor shook hands with various alien dignitaries, accepting a modest diplomatic exchange and declining most of the grand offers. As his shuttle departed the council station, he looked back at the massive structure that represented the galaxy's attempt at civilized cooperation. "Think they'll treat us differently now?" asked Captain Roy Patterson, who had served as military advisor during the negotiations. Robert smiled grimly. "They'll treat us with respect, but also with fear. They've seen what we're capable of when we're truly threatened. The question is whether they'll remember the lesson when the next crisis comes." In the depths of space, far beyond the galactic rim, the surviving Void Swarm units fled into the cosmic dark. For the first time in their millions of years of existence, they carried something new in their collective consciousness: the concept of fear. They had encountered a species that would rather unmake reality itself than accept defeat, and that knowledge would haunt them across the vast emptiness between galaxies. The galaxy settled into an uneasy peace, knowing that somewhere in human space, impossible weapons waited in dimensional storage. Ships that could rewrite the laws of physics, commanded by a species that understood both the necessity of ultimate force and the terrible responsibility that came with wielding it. Humanity had saved the galaxy, but more importantly, they had shown the wisdom to put their weapons away when the job was done. That combination of devastating power and moral restraint would define humanity's place in galactic politics for centuries to come. The age of viewing humans as primitive Deathworlders was over. The age of fearing and respecting them had just begun.